Right. Well, good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name's Lakeisha Butler. I am the immediate past president of NPhA, and we're so excited to be hosting today's event. This is a professional development workshop or seminar that we are going to hear from just some wonderful ladies that exude Black excellence and that are going to share tips on how to secure the bag as it relates to career advancement. And so without further ado, I do want to turn it over to our president of NPhA, Dr. Marable, for some words before we jump into tonight's program.
Good evening, everyone, and happy Black History Month. I wanted to thank each of you for joining us this evening for a great session of career and educational development. We're looking forward to hearing some gems that we'll all be able to take back and carry us forward throughout our time and tenure within the profession. I wanted to give an expression of appreciation for all of our panelists. And once again, to our entire audience, thank you for joining us today. Have a great evening.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Marable. At this time, I am going to have each of our panelists to introduce themselves briefly before we jump into tonight's discussion, starting with Pat.
Hello, my name is Pat Aco. I'm the manager of diversity for the Kroger Company, and I have been there over 30 years. And in addition to, I'm the director of diversity for University of Cincinnati College of Pharmacy.
All right, we'll move on. Dr. Walleen.
Hi, good evening. I'm Walleen Bullard Battle, and I am currently at Novartis as a population health account manager, medical science liaison. So been in pharmacy practice for over 25 years now and have done a little bit of every area of pharmacy practice. So happy to share those tips. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you tonight.
Okay, good evening. I'm Dawn Moore. I serve as Vice President and Chief Pharmacy Officer for Community Health Network, located in Indianapolis, Indiana. I also serve as President of Indiana Pharmacists Association. I have over 20 years of experience in pharmacy leadership roles, and I'm also happy to be with you this evening. Looking forward to the dialogue.
And Dr. Ryan.
Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on what coast you are on. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk to you all about interview tips and strategies. And my current role, I am the Department Chair of Pharmacy Practice at Mercer University College of Pharmacy. I have been a professor for 20 years now, 25 years now. So I've interviewed a lot of students as well as folks coming out of their PGY2s for faculty positions.
All right, thank you so much, panelists. As you can see, we have a wide variety of representation within the careers of pharmacy. And so I think you'll find that we'll learn a lot from each of these individuals. So let's go ahead and jump in. So my first question that I want the panelists, please feel free to speak up and share your thoughts. When we think about job candidates or even residency candidates, they are coming in, and specifically our minoritized individuals, they're applying for positions, applying for residencies, and ultimately we want to share some tips to make them stronger when applying for these positions. So what I would like for you to do is to share what specific tips you wish job candidates, residency candidates knew to make them stronger when applying for positions. So you can talk about their CV, resume, cover letter, letter of intent, interview, or follow up after the interview. So those are just some thoughts as it relates to what tips or types of tips you would want them to know to make them stronger.
I'll start off.
Oh, okay, go ahead, Pat, you start.
I'll just jump in here and start off. One thing that most of us, we trip up on a lot of times is usually that first question. Tell me about yourself. And usually when someone asks, tell me about yourself, we go on and on and on. And so my tip is that when someone says, tell me about yourself, think of 3 areas where you can kind of frame it up. Say something such as, is it okay if I tell you about my experience? For an alternative might be for our students, relevant projects that I've worked on. Or it could be key characteristics that match the job description, something where it's no more than 3, and then it's 30 to 45 seconds tops. So it should be clear and succinct with that first question of, tell me something about yourself.
I'd agree with that. Also, really make sure you understand the job description well. And it may feel a little artificial, but parroting back some of those key words out of the job descriptions, most of the time the interviewer will not necessarily, you might think it would be a red flag, but it's not. And you do want to incorporate that you can fit into what the job description is. So make that part of your elevator speech. Do have some talking points to integrate into. You don't necessarily have to have them memorized, but have said them to a couple of different friends, as well as preceptors and other hiring managers that you might know or work with. Don't hesitate to ask for coaching when you are getting ready for your interview season. A lot of folks that I am seeing now are well coached. It's obvious that they've practiced with someone and gotten feedback on how to get better. And I really would like to see us do the same. Okay.
I tell you, this is such a loaded question. So much can be said here. But before you even make it to the interview, we're looking at you on paper. So if your CV and resume, is not what it should be, such as listing your rotations and your projects, your grammar, you may not even make it to have the conversation. Okay, so that's the reality of it too, especially in those more competitive roles. The weeding out is really that, to that detail. Also, your letter of intent, we want you to tailor it to our program. We want you to know about us. So especially if you're looking for residency and, you may have this general letter that you're using, make sure you tweak it enough that we know that you're talking about us and not someone else, or it's not just so general that it could be applied anywhere. So that's definitely a key, because we do want you to make it to see us, to be able to portray and communicate as described earlier. So on paper is very important, because that's the first weeding out process right there for us.
And I'll add to that, definitely, in looking at, well, 2 things. So one, when Lakeisha, when you first asked, okay, what are the things, I go back to what Dr. Ryan said, when that know the description and be able to speak to that in the sense of you're tailoring, I should say, each and every one to that particular description, including that, she said the letter intent, but that resume. Now with so many options, people are using AI, that artificial intelligence, to kind of weed out the resumes before they even get to the hiring manager or the residency director. So if your resume is not tailored to the key words that particular program is seeking or that particular job is seeking, yeah, you may not get to step 1. And if you get there, make sure your conversation is tailored to the words in the job description. Because as an example, every clinical pharmacist job isn't the same job. Every I mean, industry, every medical science liaison, even though it's broadly the same, specifics are not exactly the same. So I think you want to make sure those specific things that let people know your career, your job, your talents match the description enough that you can even get that first step.
So I want to jump in real quick and make sure that we stay focused a little bit of time on the CV and resume, because I think that, as you mentioned, that's the first step, right? So that is a weed out process. And if we can kind of talk a little bit more about any other tips. I know, for instance, typos, those are just kind of things that we can make sure that they don't exist. And they could honestly be a weed out detail that we just missed. But what other tips, when you're looking at CVs, what makes individuals stand out with their CV and their resume? So you've certainly hit on this importance of tailoring it to the keywords in the job description, but let's spend a little bit more time there.
One suggestion that I would have is add numbers where you can add numbers. I supervise how many people. My pharmacy had sales of how much. We don't want to just know what you've done, but we want to know the impact of what you've done. So numbers where you can instill numbers really help paint the picture about you and the things and the impact that you've had in your roles.
And students and residents, you may not have the numbers yet. However, speak to your experience, projects, your goal, the outcomes, and the impact, with those, with that experience. So be open. Let us read about those. List your rotations. Let us know what you've been involved in. You'd be surprised. We receive CVs and resumes with none of that information, and we're not going to search for it. However, it's important that you note that for us. We like to see your extracurriculars, some balance of, schoolwork as well. So show yourself in that.
I think we could take a moment here, because I did just do a quick poll to understand who and what we're doing, because we do need to delineate in our discussion if we're talking to students getting ready for residencies versus someone mid-career or early career trying to talk, because as you mentioned, Don, there's how do you get that data in there correctly, but also there's a difference between that resume and that CV, and looking at details. So I think, Lakeisha, we kind of, split it up a little bit.
Yep. So I will say we have a wide variety. If you are noticing in the chat, we actually have the full spectrum of students. We also have early career individuals and mid-career. So if we can try to speak to all areas, I think that would be helpful. Okay.
So I agree. Right. I think the way a lot of, today, the shift in resumes, as we mentioned, one is those keywords that a lot of companies are using to do, I'll call it tier one, triage through, because then tier one is that resume first level is just even level set where you may be, having been in academia, hospital, different ones. They are so different now, where you got tier one, then tier two is maybe the HR person calls you for a call, then you may get the call with the hiring manager. So you can be anywhere from 1 to 3, interviews are being looked at from that letter all the way up. So all the way through, you need to make sure you are having all your information succinct to that particular. I think one of the most important things is succinct to that particular job. So does that mean, yes, if you're doing 5, if you're applying to 5 jobs, you have 5 additions or revisions of that general resume. I think I tell everyone, have like your CV with everything in it. And then you should, from there, or I'll say CV with everything you've ever done in it. So you have it all in one place. And then you're going to kind of tailor and cut and paste that to meet the job, so that you're making sure you're having the meat of the information that is pertinent to what that job details are. and keeping it, succinct. I think that's the big word, being succinct with that, and being able to expand as you need based on the opportunity, or your cover letter or letter of intent will give a little more meat to some of the details, and they should match. So making sure whatever I put in my summary, they're going to be able to find that in your CV or resume. So I'll let someone else add.
Yeah, that's a great point. One question in the chat is pertaining to resumes, and it says, how important is it to have a one-page resume? Can anyone speak to that?
I don't think you can right now. That doesn't give enough information. I think overall, we kind of talk about 2 is still good for a resume. And if you're mid-career, maybe even 3 based on how long you've been somewhere, what details, but 2 will hit pretty much what you need to hit, highlight, that gets people interested. Because and even in pharmacy, we know right now we're in a unique area where we've come to, it seems like, a surplus, where there are more people than there are opportunities that I've heard. And I had at least one of our colleagues, Dr. Coleman, had a job offer out. And for the first time ever, she said she had over 100 pharmacists apply. So when I talk to HR, Pat, this is probably your area, or even Dawn, if you have hundreds, you don't have time to read more than the highlights. I need 60 seconds, like your elevator speech. What does that resume say about you that entices me to want to go further?
Yeah, I was going to add the same thing. People really don't have time. And guess what? They're picking up your resume as they're walking to the room, probably to meet with you. So it is just a matter of seconds. If you can bullet point, like one bullet point or something that stands out with the job description, but you don't want to have a whole sheet of bullets, highlighted there. But, again, it's very important to not only be succinct, but again, talk to that job description is so important.
So another question related to resume is, at what point in your career should you transition from a CV to a resume?
Yeah, I can't, in my world, we always have CVs in academia. So this is why I'm not really commenting on resumes too much.
Yeah, so that's a good point. In academia, CVs are the go-to, but it really depends on the discipline. Pat?
Yeah, and in retail, it's resumes more so. So it's really going to depend on who you're applying to.
And your role.
Audience.
Yeah.
And the role.
And the role. Yeah. And the role.
Yeah, and in industry, I want Dr. Bullard, can you speak a little bit? It depends on the role in industry. I think if you're a liaison, they want to see CVs, but
actually no. Even in these roles, you can still do a resume or a shortened CV. It's still about 2 pages. And keeping it there, your information. I was getting ready to say, I think also for those mid-careers who want to move to executive level, Don and Pat, you can speak to that, how you position your information now and your leadership skills. I will say sometimes a executive summary at the top has been effective in highlighting who you are, and then the rest of, if they want to keep reading, to read. But that is kind of, as you start to get more sophisticated, I won't go too much into that with this, but there are different ways in which you can address that. But that's why I say, hey, write your CV, have everything you've ever done kind of in that, and then you can pull a resume off of that. But me being a person, I haven't spent all of my career in one field. I've been in academia, I've been in managed care, I've been in industry and consulting. So that's why I'm like, okay, based on where I need to move, I'm adjust that resume or CV and pick which one I need for that particular industry. So that's an important point. Know your industry. Know the industry you're applying for. Make sure you talk to the people in that industry to know which one is your best fit.
That's a great point. Definitely finding someone in the type of position you're pursuing so that you can get some coaching and tips on how best to prepare. Another question before we kind of shift gears from the resume and CV is, how far back in your career should your resume go?
Wow, I think, of course, it will depend on where you are. So if you just graduate, if you're just out from college, you just graduated or just finished residency, you may still list some rotations or things that are pertinent. So you may have to go back far enough to where you have enough substantiated or proven successes or experience in order to help sell yourself too. Now, you can't be out 10 years and then going back to college, stuff, that's definitely not. So if you haven't done anything between that time, I'm not recommending that either. But I don't know if there's a magic number necessarily, but you need to balance. We don't want to see everything back in your college days if you've been out in practice for over 5 years. I mean, personally, I wouldn't care to have all of that information listed. That's too much. You need to focus on your professional experience. So it's where you are in your career spectrum that will determine, how far you should go back or how much you need to include. But if you did something, I guess, magnificent, you saved the world, you got this one award that was ever granted, and no one else received it, and you want to keep that on there, I mean, some way to mention that, that's fine. But I would say 5 years. If you've been out, don't put anything from your school time. You have enough time and opportunity to develop valuable experience to speak to.
Unless you held a national office, would that be it would have to be a very high level award or accomplishment for something you did in school to be worth putting on your CV or resume after 5 years. Probably the exception would be if you published and it's an academic position, or you were a student and you published. Maybe if you were going into some type of industry position and you published in the area that aligned the therapeutic area or something like that as a student, maybe. But it needs to be highly relevant or really I call it sparkle, a lot of sparkle there. So a national office or something like that.
Okay, now those are all great tips. So I want to switch gears. So let's say that your letter of intent, your cover letter, or your resume and CV, they have made it past that first layer or round, and you're invited for an interview. So let's dig a little bit deeper into even talking about some successful versus unsuccessful candidates as it relates to interviews. I think this tends to be the weed out process as well, and an area that we might want to spend a little bit more time on. So feel free to jump in and share your tips as it relates to interviews.
I'll jump in. I will say that the resume starts when you enter the building. Don't think that the resume is starting when you go in the room and sit down. When they come out to get you when they come get you, how you walk, how you articulate yourself. Do you walk with confidence? What are your nonverbals that you're pulling off that they're seeing about you? So when they start that small chat, as they walk you to the room, be mindful of that and make sure you're on your guard with that. Also, when you are in the room, make sure that you're thinking about the interviewer, from their lens, not from your lens. What are some things that's going to make the candidate successful from the interviewer's lens? What can you do there? And then lastly, I would say, you want to give in your answers, not get. A lot of times people say, why do you want this position? Well, it's going to further my career. It's going to do this for me or that for me. We need to change that so that you're going to help the organization. My skills are aligned with the organization's mission, and I think I could be an asset to the organization. So it's all about having the right viewpoint. And I've also seen studies that if you go in an interview with a sense of gratitude, right? That comes off in an interview. So those are just a few nuggets to think about as you go into that interview.
Yes, I would agree with that. And make sure you have questions, good questions. Some of the things that I have seen and would avoid and are just really a complete turnoff for me as somebody that hires and manages people is a sense of questions that are indicators this person might be difficult to manage. And I call them, are you going to make me questions? So in my world, well, how often am I going to have to publish? Well, don't you want to publish? You know, it needs to be, I'm interested in publishing. This is something that I'm working at, and so forth and so on. Again, that much more of I want to give, not what are you going to make me do? You're not going to make me teach the first month I'm here. I've had questions like that. And these are, and you don't want to come off that way. You want to come off as, I am here, I'm excited to be interviewing, and I am here to serve the institution, not what can I get out of this institution. When that becomes clear, you really do move down the rank of hireability, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I agree with everything. It's so interesting because one of our questions we have listed here, what trait, asset, characteristic of yours do you think will enrich this program? So we're going to ask you, how are you going to help us? And always be careful not to be negative. You know, don't speak negative of anyone or anything. Of course, you may have had challenging experiences, and we all know that. But how you communicate or articulate those experiences matter. So, because we're going to ask you about that too. You know, tell us about, you know, a rotation or a job or something that you didn't like. You know, how did you deal with that or describe that? So you want to be careful in how you convey that information. And of course, we all have challenges, but it's not about the challenges, it's how we react, how we overcome, and just be as positive as possible. Always, but don't come off negative. Please don't, you know, because it's a reality and we know it's natural feelings. However, we don't want to have someone who will possibly go back and say something negative about us too, you know, a reputation. So be very mindful of that. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please. I have more and I'll just interject and we'll go on. Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
No, wow, of course, I agree with everything was said. When you said that about not being negative, don't badmouth anybody. This is pharmacy. I promise you don't know who. I promise you don't know how far and how deep the lines go and relationships go. You know, to the point, even an example, I was interviewing for a job, didn't know anybody from my school, let alone someone I went to school with was at the company. And so they called that person up and was like, hey, do you know such and such? And they're like, oh yeah, that's a great person. Or I've had the phone call. Well, hey, I'm getting ready. I just got a resume from such and such. Do you know them? They went to your school around the time. So that is something key with not being negative, because you don't know how that will play out in a bigger picture. But the other thing to Pat's comment about the moment you walk in the door, it's the interview. Also, especially for everyone who's going through residency, you know, interviewing, going to mid-year, or even going to like a company, if any company, especially even internships, if they have workshops, if they got happy hour, they got meet and greet, that is still the interview. Do not skip. I had the conversation with my daughter who was in college, was like, oh, she's trying to do internships and they offered opportunity to meet the team. So they had some virtual meet and greet. From virtuals, learn more about us. And she was like, oh, I don't feel like going. Like, yeah, no, you have to go. Did she get the jobs? Yes, she did. That you don't know, because they're giving you tips, but they're getting to know you. So they get to know you better than they get to know someone else. But more importantly, that is also part of the interview. It's that soft skills, the unwritten rules of interviewing. You must attend.
Right.
I
So those,
totally agree with that too. And then sometimes, or back in the day before COVID and everything hit, you would probably get a lunch or a dinner, or maybe you arrive, the evening before. You're being interviewed at that time as well. So how you interact during those occasions matter too. How you represent yourself, how you look, so it's important. So I'm not saying wear a suit and tie to dinner, be appropriate, but then also how you carry yourself in the conversation. They are finding out about you at those moments too. So every point in that process matters. Yes.
there's a question in the chat that says, when you have a situational question about a difficult time, how can you word it without sounding negative? Any thoughts on that? So situational questions.
One way I would say is that if it's relevant, again, to the job that you're interviewing for, you can bring that up, but it's more about what have you learned from the incident. This happened to me. However, I learned how to flex and pivot and do things differently. From that experience, this happened, and I was able to do that. So again, it's like not getting down in the weeds, they did this, and this to me. And no, it's turning it into how it benefited you in the larger scheme.
You could also give a time where you receive some slightly difficult feedback. I mean, don't make it like totally tank it, but slightly difficult feedback, and how you responded and how you took that information and what you did to get better. That's a manager's dream. The fact that I don't always have to tell you you're great and wonderful in order for you to feel like you still want to work here. And that you are interested in getting better, and that you're interested in seeking that and figuring out how to get better. That tends to will really help you and really help, because a hiring manager, they want someone who's going to be easy to manage and easy to work with, quite frankly.
And another example, I know we don't always get consensus on the therapy that's needed or that's best for the patient. In these cases, I make sure I try to understand, you go through, you have some type of process and how you deal with that. Not that this doctor said this and this pharmacist thinks that, and I know I'm right, they don't know what they're talking about. It's just that in general. So you're not finger pointing, it's during our day, we don't always reach consensus on the best therapy. So this is how we approach it. So you don't have to be negative in describing a challenging situation. There are ways to articulate it that you're not making someone out to be a bad person or pointing fingers or whatever. It's more about how you are able to overcome the situation.
Are definitely some great tips. There's a couple of things that were said regarding, when you step foot in the building, that the interview starts exuding confidence, the way you're dressed, the way you talk. Let's unpack that a little bit more. I have certainly received questions from students, residents that say, well, what should I wear? How should I wear my hair? What should I say? How should I say it? So let's unpack that. If you can provide more details about that, and what does confidence look like?
Let's start sort of, I guess, top down. Well, I'll leave top to last, actually. What you should wear is a suit, preferentially, with a neutral color blouse and dark shoes. Dark suit, gray, black, blue, navy blue. Think Kamala Harris kind of look, to be honest with you. Post-COVID, I've seen just stranger things. I'm not sure if all of us being at home and being super casual has sort of spilled over. I also know that sometimes coming out of residencies, if you're in a patient care setting, that the dress code there is just a lot lax. You may be wearing scrubs all the time, so forth and so on. but coming into an interview, you need to wear a suit. The hair. I got a text from my daughter today asking me, do I have to straighten my hair? And I, in all caps, said, no, you never have to straighten your hair. With that said, what does that mean? At least in my industry, I don't think you do. But your hair shouldn't be a distractor either. I don't want someone Caucasian coming in with a mohawk that's pink. That's a distractor. I don't want to see us with, you know, locks that are bright red that aren't natural looking. So I think your hair should not be the most interesting thing about you, but at least where I'm at, I'm in Atlanta. So there's, you know, enough Black people here. I don't feel like everybody's got to straighten their hair. I think that has, at least in my industry, has been that glass ceiling has been broken. Like we don't, you know, like in academia, I think it's a little bit more free spirit enough to where we can wear our natural hair, fortunately.
I agree. Natural hair is fine. It's about being neat and presentable at the end of the day, you know, across the board, no matter, you know, how you wear your hair, it needs to be neat and presentable. And that's just, like you said, it's an opinion. Now you could be at a company and again, know your industry. We're talking to pharmacists here. So we're still a little more conservative industry overall than some others. I keep using some young people like you know, and your cultural importance is still to be you, if that's important to you culturally. But understand that now if you're in an industry like, you know, the tech industry where you can be in jeans or you can be in multicolors, that's fine. That's not necessary here. But that doesn't mean as things progress that could change, but you're talking about the interview. And we're talking about, you know, everybody's different, but you want them to see you. Like, I think as Gina said, not your hair. Like, I don't want to sit, you know, you're not in the interview the whole time being distracted. And then they want you, then your personality comes out. And that's what's important, I think.
Yeah.
Someone asked. See this. Oh, go ahead.
Someone asked about a hijab. Yeah, I think in my space it would be okay. I'm not sure, honestly, about other spaces, unfortunately, and that's sad. I'm not sure I could confidently say, yeah, sure. I wish I could.
And I think too, what can be somewhat misleading is that organizations say that they accept diversity in variety, but that's certain people in the organization. That's not always everybody. Unfortunately, we have not evolved to that all the way everywhere. So as mentioned earlier, if you're in Atlanta, you have natural hair, that's probably much more acceptable than if you are probably, and I probably shouldn't say this, because I lived in the state, so I lived in Iowa City for 6 years. Not saying it wouldn't be accepted, but it would be different. It may be viewed a little differently. I think you need to know your environment. I'm not saying not to, but just understand that everything may not always be fully acceptable, even though organizations may state that they pride themselves on embracing diversity. Just understand that. But if it's important to you, you know, be neat, and try not to make it a distraction. Yeah, like I said earlier, don't let that be what interests them in you.
And I will say in retail, again, you want to know your industry. We are business casual, so it may not be a full suit for men. It may be a jacket, khakis, but something like that. So it's you're not coming all the way in a suit and tie. But again, know your industry so you're aware of the culture there.
Yeah, so I definitely want to acknowledge some comments that were made in the chat regarding, companies that may not embrace equity and inclusion. And there are a number of them, honestly, that are performative, unfortunately. And they need individuals like us to get into those companies and change things. But to the point of what Don has said and others, it may take, really researching and saying, okay, what does this particular organization expect? And what is their view of professionalism? And if you want to impact that organization to change things, let me get in now and actually, change some policies and change the culture. There are, like I said, there are a number of companies that are performative as it relates to equity and inclusion. They have the statements that we embrace, but truly they don't. I had a question for the panelists, and I know this is really a very touchy subject, hot topic. When we think about professionalism, what does professionalism look like while still being authentic and genuine? It's a loaded question, but I think it's so important for us to address that.
I will question without loading, and you meaning just being authentic self, being your ethnically, culturally relevant to what you want to be and do. It's loaded, but I think, like you said, and to Don's point, many places have evolved. And if you're in a much more diverse community, city, or area, it's probably more readily than somewhere else you're not. But I will speak to the fact that being yourself authentically, look, they see who you are when you walk in the door. So that takes care of that right there. It's like your skin tone, your hair texture. I'm like, if your name is unisex or anything like that, they kind of know that walking in, and that already gives an impression. But this can be taken as I would say, not just as a grain of salt, but just as one perspective. What I've done over the years was that I want to come in safe. That may not be everyone's the radical, but I want to come into the interview safe. And safe meaning I may have my hair straight. I may have my hair, if you're going to be natural, if you have your locks, it's just freshly done. I mean, a fresh hairstyle, I don't care if it's twist or what have you. It's just fresh. You're going to do that for an interview. It's not days old. I think, fresh cut, whatever, you're going to plan for the interview that way. And I always say, you want them to love you, then you make your changes. Like once I'm in, then I can wear all of my fancy jewelry. I love wearing costume jewelry and, and statement pieces and all of that. I'm not doing that in my interview, but, I get to express me when I get in to express me and get to know that. So that's just a way of saying I may be more just neutral. But then if you talk about the personality, it'd be that way. But definitely once we're in, it's an opportunity that they want me. And when you want me, then you can kind of get out and express a little bit more, and they get to know who all of me is. But you can't get all of that in an interview anyway. But that's just one way of looking at it.
And I would tell you, people will say they want to see you. They want your authentic self. Before doing this panel, I talked to several of my directors and asked just in general, their thoughts on some of these talking points. And, some would say, we don't want someone too rigid. We don't want someone too lax. Sometimes they're just too lax. But I would tell you, in certain areas of pharmacy practice, they may not fully understand our culture. Okay. So while we try to be authentic, they may not fully appreciate what that looks like. Okay. So they may say this and they may say that, but can't relate or misunderstand it. Okay. So I would personally, I would still, you can be authentic. And I take that word as meaning I'm not going to portray something I'm not. You can still give honest answers. You can still communicate in the way you should. You're not compromising yourself. However, the way you do present yourself and convey, you have to maybe understand what that norm of acceptance is. I still caution some of that. We can't be all of ourselves necessarily. And you have to know who's interviewing you. It's good to know who's conducting this interview, what they've studied, what their practice interests are, what they look like if you can. Many people are on LinkedIn, right? Research and kind of get that sense. And that's just something, I don't know if there is a true script to this or an exact answer, but use your intuition. I mean, it'll be different talking to us, this panel interviewing, than it would be maybe some of my colleagues who are not as familiar and may have different expectations of what's required in an interview. Sometimes people say things that they may not truly, well, they mean it, but they may not know how to handle it or what to expect. So anyway, I just put it out there. Learn that it's a balance. I'll tell you it's a balance. I don't know if anybody has the exact code for everything, but yeah, it's a balance.
There, you have to code shift, and period. You can't be who you may be at your, say, family reunion that you are at work. And it is probably, it's more extreme for Black people. I think those code shift. I think everybody probably code shift, and we code shift even more because it can be very, very different from home to work or family to work and so forth and so on, and friends to work sometimes. You do want to know your audience. You can, like in my industry, do a PubMed search on people who you're interviewing. You know, my specialty is in diabetes. Don't come in and get the diabetes stuff wrong. If that's what you're going to present on, or just stay away from it. You know, even need to say the same, because then you don't have to try to get it super tight. But there is a need to code shift. And a lot of times when I am interviewing minority candidates, I can see the extra cognitive load that it takes to do the code shifting, which is why it makes it more difficult for us to interview, which is why we need to practice a little bit more, because we're nervous, we're trying to code shift, we're trying to be serious, but not too serious, and yet and have some personality all at the same time. And I always feel so sorry for some of the candidates, because I can see their head, they're just trying to spin, and then they see me, they're like, okay, oh, okay, I can kind of sigh a little, you know, and I'm like, it's gonna be okay. But that extra takes an extra mental energy. That's what cognitive load means, to code shift. And you do have to do that in an interview, period. And, you know, that is particularly if you're looking at large organizations. Now, if you're interviewing at a college, okay, and you can, again, you've done your research and you find that most of these faculty are working with indigent, working and serving the underserved, then that's going to tell you you're going to be in a different environment than if you're in some very straight ahead, very conservative corporate environment. And you're going to need to tailor yourself to that. And if you don't want to tailor yourself to that, that may be okay, and you don't want to work there. And that's a personal choice too, and it is okay. Same thing kind of with the hair. You know, if you want the diggity wiggity, that might not fit in there. There may be another place for you, but not, you know, but that's going to be you're going to be hitting a glass ceiling there, quite frankly. So, and Dr. Bullard said, maybe you can kind of tighten it up for the interview and let it a little bit loose when you get in there. And I think that's okay too.
Yeah, so there's a question as it relates to, would you recommend contacting the hiring manager or other company employees directly via email to express interest in a position, or just submit the application and send a follow-up email 2 to 3 days afterwards? Any thoughts on that?
I don't see where that can hurt. Sometimes, depending on the intake process, you may be screened at a different level in HR, and the hiring manager may not even see your information, your application. So it's nothing, I don't see where it can hurt to make sure you're seen in that, at another level versus just the application. So I think that's a good idea personally.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. In academia, for pharmacy practice, it's always going to be the pharmacy practice chair. So that's a little easier to find. I think in pharma and y'all that are in this industry, sometimes it can be a little difficult to figure out who the hiring manager is in some of the other positions. So.
Yeah. I agree. Again, it's not a bad idea, but it's also a good idea after the fact too, to send a follow-up. And I will tell you, recently I had an interview and it was handwritten. Handwritten is a good thing, and not just electronic, email, or whatever, but handwritten can also be a plus, because I remember them taking the time to write that handwritten note versus an email.
All right, there's some other,
concern.
oh, go ahead.
I'm just going to concur with others and saying, yes, that you should try to reach out, use your network, and from based on the industry, your colleagues, what have you. If you can't find the hiring manager, to at least find, if there's someone else who's in that area, to know, because that has happened. And personally, that's happened for me, where I did apply for something that I actually got the email from, the auto HR that says, thanks for applying. You're not going to be qualified. I spoke to the hiring manager and they went back and pulled my resume to interview me. Even after I got that, I'm like,
so a couple of more questions in the chat. Okay, sorry about that, Dr. Walling. I think you froze on us. The next question is, what are some strategies to negotiate compensation? Specifically, what can women do to anticipate and avoid offers lower than male counterparts? So salary negotiation. First off, is this a question that should be discussed during the interview?
No.
oh,
Only,
no.
and they only after they have made the offer should you talk about negotiating.
Or money, period.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that some places in the screening part early on ask about salary, even before it comes to my team to interview, as what's your current salary or what are you looking to make? So they do note that. However, I don't know if because I'm not a part of that call, but I don't know if they discourage a candidate at that time when they're doing this screening. But I know in the notes they put this person makes, 100 and some thousand, or this is the percentile of what our range is, and et cetera. So they may approach you and ask that. So, which can be a little tricky because you don't want to weed yourself out before you even have a chance to meet the people who are doing the hiring or making the final decision. But I think it's okay to state that it's negotiable. And as you learn more, as you get further in the process, or after, we've had a better interaction with you, a more thorough interaction with you, a dialogue, that then you can have those conversations, especially if you're offered the role. But it's not uncommon, unfortunately. I do know that they do bring up that conversation or that topic early on, which can be a little compromising, or because you don't want to outprice yourself right up, in the beginning. But that's a little tricky too. But that doesn't mean you can't negotiate. Just because you say one thing doesn't mean you can't negotiate in the end. So do know that.
You can try to avoid the answering and saying, I'm sure we'll be able to negotiate something I hear this is a very competitive, position. And I'm sure once I understand the full responsibilities, then I'll be able to better talk about what how much the compensation should be. I think many times they will have HR ask those questions about the money. And so that way the hiring manager is not sort of in this entangled discussion with the candidate. So if it's HR, you can say, well, once I talk to the hiring manager and I fully understand the full, responsibilities of this position, then I think I can probably better, make sure that the pay is, commensurate or something like that with the job. And usually they'll let it go.
Mhm. Yeah, based on what I have to
Question.
offer. Yep.
Yes. Yeah.
There's-
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a question pertaining to gender gap. So we know that exists definitely in organizations. But I think this would be, after you were to get the job or even during the negotiation phase, it's kind of difficult to find out information on where the gender gap exists unless the salaries are public information. Does anyone have any additional comments on addressing the gender gap in salary?
Well, in education, our association, American Association of Colleges of Pharmacy, actually publishes the average salary of various faculty positions. So if you are interviewing for a faculty position, ask one of your former faculty, to pull that information for you so you can see where you should be. Other companies now are starting to publish more upfront in the ads, in the job ads, the salary range. And they say that it's to try to get more equity. Someone told me that one of the pharmaceutical companies is no longer negotiating salaries, and they're setting the salaries just to create more equity so you don't have this gender gap. So I think it'll be interesting going forward to see what happens there. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say in not all industry, but in pharmaceutical industry, that is happening. Within the role that I'm in as a medical science liaison, you have, I think the same thing to you, Gina, the society, the trade organization who's doing, so the MSL Society has done a survey out there, annual salary survey they've been doing for years to get kind of a real spill. And if you give your demographic information, you kind of can now get that information, understand what's the range. But it still is going to be hard to identify. Even our company is saying they've signed up for this pay equity DEI, to be more transparent, but I don't think it's still very transparent, because unless you actually know the salary range that's preset from this dollar to that dollar, you're really not getting an understanding of that, and where and where they think you sit in that opportunity. But there is things in the works that different organizations are doing. Definitely go to the trade organization for that industry. Many of them may have the salary. I think the online, salary.com tools are not as accurate, because in pharmacy, they don't really know our roles. They're much more generic. So it's kind of harder, I think, if I've looked at some of those, to actually get an accurate account of what salary should be.
Usually, we're not going to offer you the highest salary in that range. I mean, that very seldom happens unless we're going after someone and we're barely able to, we know that we could afford them, we'll, maybe do that. But when you get an offer, there's usually room for negotiation, at least 95% of the time. I mean, we're not going to come to you with the top. Okay. So do know that it's nothing wrong with asking for more. I mean, because if they don't want to give you more or can't give you more, they'll tell you, but they're not going to give you more if you don't ask for it. Okay. So always keep that in mind. I would say, as far as the gap is concerned, I see a lot of gaps come about due to compression in the market, not necessarily hiring one, starting someone and higher than the other. I don't doubt that it exists because I still believe it exists. I'm going to offer you more because I think where you practiced before, you had more valuable experience, or you did this, so that means you are, a little more qualified. So that does still exist. How do you address that? That's challenging. Unless you know for sure, it's hard to unveil that or discover that unless you just know that you're lowballed, to a certain degree. But just go in knowing that there's usually always opportunity to get more because we're not going to come to you at the top of the range.
There's another question in the chat that asks, how can adults who have taken breaks for life events strategize to get back on financial trajectories? And I'm assuming Stephanie, if you want to speak up, when you say to get back on financial trajectories, are you meaning to get back into your career? You can clarify that.
Yeah, so specifically if, and this usually happens with females, which kind of also drives the gender gap, is we take breaks to have kids, we take breaks to be wives, and before we know it, it's been 5 or 10 from when we were making a very significant amount to a lesser amount. So do you have any advice for pursuing roles that may not be, 5 to 8% more than what you're making, but are, 15 to 20% more than what you're making? How do we identify those opportunities and secure them so that we are not perpetually behind and are kind of persisting in the gender gap?
Any comments to the question?
We speak to that or from that, that's, it's quite a lot, like you say, to unpack in that question of how to do that. And, for whatever reason, any of us, whether it's life events, even if you had a long-term illness or something that takes you out, unfortunately, that's going to put your financial trajectory behind. And I think it's more of a reset, a recalibration of what that may look like from where you're starting from, than to look at what was lost and maybe saying, okay, from this point, if I'm here, how does that look going forward, and make an adjustment there. But also, because I want to add that gap or that loss could be even whether it's a life event or also changing industries. I might give an example. If you're in retail where it was higher pay, if you decide you want to go in academia, or if you want to go into hospital, that pay salary is different. And it may be less, but you may gain more value and more quality. So sometimes it's not just the money you're looking at. Sometimes you've got to look at what the overall quality for yourself looks like in your opportunity. Because sometimes I'll say you take a step back, move forward in a career path that satisfies where you're going. So I think it's adjustments to what that thought process looks like. I think long-term, as far as financial trajectories, you really have to reset that caliber or that goal for everyone. And I know that from personal, it's like, if you've been married, you've been divorced, if you've never been divorced and married, your financial trajectory is just different. And don't let that be a comparison, but set it up for yourself as to where you're going to be from where you are, and set that plan, obviously, with a financial advisor. But within the career path, to the original question, I think how to get yourself back on track would be, there's a difference, coaching. Career coaching would be one, having, being up to date on the industry that you're in. Some of the tips that I always give about that is, if you're changing industries, know what's the latest, know the buzzwords. Again, you're talking to those who are in there in your network, because sometimes it's going to take networking to get yourself back in to an opportunity that just applying blindly might not be the the easiest or the shortest route. Networking would play a big role in that.
I think that's very insightful. And so continue to go to conferences if you can. Keep yourself up on all of the new material or the different practices out there, especially in the field that you're looking to re-enter into. Yeah, and the quality of work life is important. So it may be a trade-off. You may get paid more and the quality of work life may not be as appealing versus you might not paid as much, but you're not as stressed and you feel more comfortable or you enjoy what you're doing more. And then it's not always about the salary either. You look at the full compensation package. You look at retirement, what's being contributed. You look at, your PTO time. What does that look like? So, and the flexibility of hours. So there are just certain things. I mean, you should look at the total package as well. But I'm not saying if you're making such a high amount that you just drop all the way low, because sometimes you may not be able to afford that. But look at the full package and maybe that may be more attractive to you. It may make up in some other areas.
And I always recommend to try to come into a company at the highest point that you can, where your education and everything is, and then performance. Once you get in there and you perform and you can show what you can do, then you can look to move up, and that helps the trajectory as well.
Right. These have been all great tips that you all are offering. We were slated for an hour, but I'm thankful that our panelists are sticking around and our guest as well. I want to open it up for any final comments, last minute tips that you may not have been able to share during this conversation. If we can go forward with any last minute tips that you want to end our time together with. Well,
one thing that I would say is go into your interview and be prepared. Don't just think you're ready and you can do this. No, this is something, your job, so prepare like it is. And one thing I would always say too, when you go into a job and you open your portfolio, don't just have an empty page. I like to say have a typewritten page with questions that you're going to ask. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? To show that you're prepared. Sometimes handwritten notes may seem like you just wrote those coming in. So be prepared, look prepared for the part when you go in. And I know that you can do a great job. And lastly, I put a contact or a resource in the chat called Nailed It. I think that's a great resource to really help you in the interviewing process.
I just placed my email address in the chat. If you are interviewing for a faculty member position and you want a little bit more detailed coaching, please reach out to me. I'm happy to kind of give you a lot more details, specific details about applying for this type of position. I want to see you succeed.
And absolutely concur with everything. And I put in the chat one thing I thought was important with the interview, and that was coming with questions. So I says never show up in an interview and say, I don't have any questions when they ask you for questions. Always prepare at least one or two, even something as simple as saying, what do you see as what's a successful candidate has what characteristics, qualities, something, but always have some questions. We end with that as you round out and be prepared for your interview.
And I will say, yeah, I definitely agree with everything that's been said. And one thing that I don't know if we touched on, the letter of recommendations and finding those, credible references. You want to make sure you're going to select those who are going to write great things about you and can give examples of how wonderful you are or how well you work or how well-rounded of a person you are. Sometimes it's not what's said, it's what's unsaid too. So you want to make sure you choose your references wisely. I know that some of you may be in environments or locations in which it may be hard to get a great reference. I mean, it's just, these are the times, right? But do your best. I mean, broaden out. make connections with people who you know will advocate for you as strongly as possible. So yeah, be aware of that as well. So thank you.
All right. Well, I just have to say this has been amazing. The tips have been so on point. And I was just private chatting a few people that we have to continue this. I think that this would be a great session for us to continue even at our upcoming NPhA SNAFA conference that is slated for the last weekend in July. So we hope that you all, if you are first off not members of NPhA, that you will join. And if you are members, that you will also join us at our conference, our annual conference that will be held in Atlanta, Georgia, the end of July. And so more information can be found on our website, npha.net. Thank you so much to our panelists. You all have certainly dropped some important, informative, impactful nuggets for all of our attendees. Thank you for your time. Thank you to the attendees for your engagement and your questions. And with that, we will say good night.
Good luck, everyone, with your job searches.
Thank